Thank you, Reed. H.B. Armitage is with me. He is Director of Flight Operations at Georgia Tech. Thank you for joining us today. As you watched what happened today, I know you were a friend of the commander, Dick Scobee. You must have been horrified.
Absolutely. It was a very terrible experience to know something like this was happening. It's a terrible disaster.
And yet there's no doubt in your mind that the program must go on.
Oh, absolutely. Just like we have airplanes that occasionally explode, like we have a furnace in the homes that explode when you have the right combination of fuel, air, and a spark. This can happen in the most sophisticated of equipment ever built. It appears that maybe something of this nature is what happened today.
Yes, astronaut Eugene Cernan has speculated that the containers separating the two kinds of fuels that are used ruptured, causing the explosion. Does that sound right to you?
That's a possibility, yes. But we have no information at this point to really verify anything.
He also says there is a procedure for the shuttle to separate from the boosters once there is a crisis, but there wasn't enough time in this case. Can you explain how that works?
Well, I can't explain the exact details of the separation, but whenever you have something as large as the shuttle, it takes, because of the inertia effect, it takes time for the shuttle to separate from the booster packages, or the booster packages separate from the shuttle. And this cannot be done in a matter of an instant. And frequently, when you have an explosion of this type, the crew may have only had 1 or 2 seconds notification that this was about to happen, and you just can't react that fast.
So you're saying that given enough warning, it could have been maneuvered away. How much warning?
That's difficult to answer also. Yes, if given enough warning, is a strong probability that the boosters and the shuttle could have separated and not caused, if that's what caused this one.
Does it bother you that there was a delay this morning that had to do with a fire alarm?
It's very difficult at this point to say that that had anything to do with it. In fact, we would all be just guessing at this point. Anytime you have mechanical problems, sure, it bothers us, whether it's an airplane or shuttle or whatever. But at this point, I think it's way too early to speculate.
And the cold weather. This is something new for NASA, too, isn't it?
Yes, but I don't think the cold weather really had anything to do with this type of thing.
Will we ever know what happened? Is there the equivalent of a black box on a shuttle?
Oh, yes. And I think, without a doubt, they probably will know in time, but it will take considerable investigation. It will take time, and it will take a lot of development and a lot of work to determine just what happened.
H.B. Armitage from Georgia Tech, thank you for joining us. And we return now to Tom and Tyr in our continuing live coverage of today's shuttle disaster. Tom?
Thank you, Lois. The picture you see behind me is off the shore of the Kennedy Space Center as search efforts are underway. They did not start for 55 minutes after the explosion because NASA says continuing debris was falling, making it impossible to move those rescue efforts into the area. We have seen a Coast Guard cutter moving across the shore about a half hour ago, but not heading in the direction of space. Let's now go to Utah Senator Jake Garn in Washington.
We have Senator Garn, who is being placed behind the microphones, Tom, in the Senate gallery. Senator, can you hear me this morning yet, sir?
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident. And so it's been very, very difficult for me this morning.
What does this do to the space program here and its support on the Hill, Senator?
Well, I have great confidence in the space program. I think it's a remarkable system, and I think we should push ahead after we have determined the cause. Obviously, we should not fly until we have determined the cause of this particular failure. But I think we need to look at all of the successes, the remarkable safety record that the space program has had, the benefits that come from it, and the crew members that I knew so well. I would expect that they would want us to go ahead with the space program after we have gone through the proper investigations and analysis and know what happened.
How should we go about investigating this?
Well, obviously, you have to gather all of the data. It has been impounded at this point. There'll have to be a lot of studies, but there are some superbly qualified experts in this area that I think will be able to determine what the failure was.
Senator, you were on board the space shuttle. You felt that tremendous boost that you got. Now, from the telemetry that we heard, the voice data that we heard, they had just told the pilot to go to full throttle, and he had said he was throttling up. What happens at that moment?
You have a combination of the solid rocket booster power and liquid hydrogen and oxygen in the main tank. And because most of your thrust comes from the solid rocket boosters, while you're still in the atmosphere, you can exceed the maximum dynamic pressure. So the main engines are only at about 60% of power until you get further out of the atmosphere. And they had just been given the command to throttle up, and then you go to 104% or maximum power on the solids, or on the liquids. And so that is exactly what had taken place. They were high enough so they would not endanger the orbiter from too much pressure, and were given that order that they could proceed to increase the power.
What are some of the things that can go wrong at that moment?
Well, you have a very large external tank of very volatile liquid hydrogen and oxygen. And you're just simply, it's like in an automobile, you are putting more fuel. You're pushing down on the accelerator, you're putting more fuel to bring more power. And of course, at this point, we don't know whether it was one of the solids, we don't know whether it was the liquid engines or not. There's just no way to know at this point.
Senator, what was your opinion of the amount of missions that NASA had scheduled for this year? Do you think that they were capable of going ahead with 14 or 15 safely?
Yes, I think so. The major problem these last couple of missions has been weather, and that is something that NASA cannot control. But yes, I think the program was mature enough that, and with the opening of the second pad, Pad B, which Challenger was launched from this morning, with 2 pads and also the addition of the 4th orbiter. Yes, I think they were capable of that schedule.
Do you think it's going to make any difference to civilians in space from now on?
Well, I can't judge what decisions NASA will make, but my own opinion, again, after the investigations, we should proceed with the program, and that would include the civilians in space program as well.
As a civilian yourself going in, were you adequately warned that something like this could happen?
Oh, of course. The training is very thorough and very adequate. In my own case, having flown more than 10,000 hours, I was certainly aware that there are dangers in flying. However, I still feel very strongly that I'm much safer in flying an aircraft than any day that I'm on the Capital Beltway, and I don't mean that to be facetious at all. We kill nearly 50,000 people a year on the in the highways of this country, because of half of them because of drunk driving. I wish we'd pay a lot more attention to that.
Senator, should there have been some way for them, or was there any way for them to get out at this point? Should there have been?
No, I don't think so. In Columbia originally, during the test phase, when just they were sending 2 test pilots up, they did have an escape capsule. The program had been proved safe enough, in my opinion, that they didn't need them in the other orbiters, and Columbia had been modified so that it did not have the escape mechanism in it. This is purely my opinion, but in watching what happened this morning, I would doubt very much, even if you had had an escape capsule on board or parachutes, that it would have been possible to get out with that kind of an explosion in any event.
Senator, in light of all of the delays surrounding recent shuttles and this one, do you think that NASA may have been too anxious to get this one off the ground?
No, I was down on Saturday and for the launch on Sunday morning, and they were criticized on Sunday for being overly careful. Safety has always been foremost in their minds. And we woke up on Sunday morning after having canceled at 10 o'clock the night before to a perfect morning. It was beautiful, sunny, clear blue skies, perfect launch, and there was a lot of talk that rather irritated me. Well, NASA was overly cautious. And so, no, I don't think that's true at all.
What happens in your subcommittee now in terms of funding for the program?
Well, I can't answer that question exactly because of Graham Rudman and the other budget constraints, but I certainly have no intentions other than to push on and that does not change the intent or the progress of the program.
How do you think the investigation ought to be handled, Senator? Should there be some sort of blue ribbon panel put together, or should NASA be allowed to handle it?
Well, I think NASA has the technical experts, and if they need more than in-house, they will pull them in. I don't think we need to go outside that other than to draw on consultants if necessary. NASA is so thorough and so careful. If any of you had experienced how they go through the redundancy and the backups and careful nature, the dedication of these scientists and engineers in NASA, I have full faith in them. They want the program to succeed. They want to take care of their astronauts. It's always a real team effort. They work closely together, and they will want to find out what happened more than anybody else.
Senator, how lucky do you feel today that you returned safely?
That's Senator Jake Garn, who's been recalling his mission and commenting on this morning's tragedy over the Kennedy Space Center, the explosion in mid-flight of the Challenger. Senator Garn, as you know, was America's first senator in space, having flown aboard Discovery in April of 1985. And the senator is recounting his flight and discussing what was happening to him and his feelings about things. Tom and Tier again in Atlanta.
Read, the picture you're seeing behind me is the seas off the shores of the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where the rescue efforts have been going on now for well over an hour. It took almost 1 hour before they could bring those crews into the area because for that time period, the debris from the exploded shuttle was still falling. CNN's John Zarella is at the Kennedy Space Center and maybe has an update for us. John?
Tom, as you just said, it was falling for about an hour after the explosion. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Nicholson of the Department of Defense just told us that the debris was falling from at least 50,000 feet, and that he doubted that that was the top altitude where debris was falling from. It was the range safety officer who was in charge, who through radar and monitoring this falling debris made the determination not to allow recovery ships and vehicles into the area until they were sure that all the debris had finally fallen into the water. At the present time, there are 2 H-3 helicopters now being handled by the Department of Defense, with the chief man in charge of the operation on board one of those helicopters. I do not have his name. There is the one C-130 aircraft in the area. There is one SRB recovery ship. Of course, that is the ship that would recover those solid rocket boosters once they have fallen back into the water. There is one Coast Guard hydrofoil on the scene. 2 more H-3 helicopters, Coast Guard helicopters out of Clearwater, Florida, are on their way to the scene, and 1 Coast Guard cutter from Grand Bahama is making its way at top speed to the rescue, to the recovery area. At this point, again, they have had no word, according to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Nicholson, from the recovery scene as to what, if anything, they have found there. He says that it may be another hour before they have any more information from the recovery scene, from those ships and helicopters that are in the area right now. Tom?
John, is there any indication that Challenger was veering off course? It was very difficult to tell from the picture here, but you were there. Are you hearing anything about the possibility that it was heading off course and maybe going back over toward inhabited land areas?
Nothing at all, Tom. I was standing right out on the edge of the water looking out at the launch pad, and of course, when it took off on that trajectory, it seemed to be making a perfect ascent right up until the moment of the explosion. And there's been so much speculation in the past hour and 36 minutes. The clock's still running on out on the pad. That perhaps at throttle back, that the SRBs, they went up to 204%, suddenly increasing in the velocity of the SRBs, and of course that the shuttle cannot handle that. But that is just all such speculation at this point, and that they couldn't throttle them back. But again, so much speculation here as to what may or may not have happened. The one thing that everybody is certain of at this point is that that after that explosion, another piece of the shuttle, whatever it might have been, whether it was a rocket or whether it was the orbiter itself, continued on for some time apparently. And no one, of course, knows what happened at that point. At least no one is saying. But again,
all right,
it's going to be about an hour, Tom.
All right, John, we'll wait for word back from you from the Kennedy Space Center. For those of you who may have just joined us, tragedy in the skies over Florida this morning at 11:39 a.m., 1 minute after liftoff. Challenger exploded in a ball of fire. There appears to have killed all 7 crew members, including the first private citizen in space, school teacher Christa McAuliffe.
7, 6.
This is a replay of the launch of Challenger, main
1,
engines igniting and lifting
off.
away from pad 39B, the first time that pad had been used in 10 years since the Apollo program. The second pad would have allowed NASA to keep its ambitious schedule of 15 launches this year.
Confirmed. Challenger now heading down range.
The large brown object you see in the center of your screen is the external tank which holds the volatile fuel.
Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%.
The white tubes are the solid rocket boosters, one on each side of that brown tank.
Shortly.
And the shuttle in this position sits below it.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
When the explosion occurred, everything seemed to be attached. The solid rockets were not scheduled to separate for several more minutes.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
That's the last words.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The twin contrails of white smoke going away from the huge fireball. The solid rocket continuing to burn as it heads toward a landing point in the ocean. Here's a slow motion replay. Now you see fire right between the space shuttle and the external tank. There are no engines there. No reason for fire to be there. And then it explodes. Shuttle still visible. Now it's gone. There were spectators watching at the Kennedy Space Center at the time, taking photographs. In this picture you're about to see here now, no indication of any problem. This is probably about 30 seconds into the flight. Christa McAuliffe's school children. You hear the yell of anticipation, the glee, the happiness that would soon change. The cries of, oh no. There you see Christa McAuliffe's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, from Framingham, Massachusetts. They stood silently during the launch. At this point, no one really realized what had happened. Just that there was a large puff of white smoke and an explosion in the sky. Those who had never witnessed a launch before are probably not realizing a NASA official climbed a couple of rows into the bleachers to where Christa McAuliffe's parents were standing, walked up and said to them, "The vehicle has exploded." A stunned Mrs. Corrigan looked back at them and repeated the words as a question. "The vehicle has exploded." He nodded silently, and then the realization of what had happened swept across Mr. and Mrs. Corrigan's face. Disbelief at first. Christa McAuliffe's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, watching as Challenger was in flight for 1 minute and then exploded in a huge fireball. It appears that there were no survivors. Let's go now to Washington and Reed Collins.
Thank you, Tom. TASS has mentioned the tragedy, saying that the Challenger has exploded on takeoff, just a brief line from the Soviet Union. Let's get back to the White House now. Charles Beerbauer perhaps can fill us in on more of what the President is saying, doing, and thinking in this hour. Charles?
Reed, we had a chance to talk with the President, a few of us, a few moments ago. He described this as a very traumatic experience for him as well as for the nation. He indeed described the astronauts themselves as pioneers and said that there have always been hazards and people have always died on the frontier, that is part of the nature of pioneering. The President watched a replay of the explosion in the study next to his Oval Office just moments after it had happened, and he'd been notified of it. He called it a horrible thing. He said, "I can't rid myself of the thought of the sacrifice made by these astronauts and made by their families." Going on to note that of course included Christa McAuliffe, whose family had, even in the White House, in the Roosevelt Room a few feet from where the President was standing, been named as that Teacher in Space program, which the President himself had instituted and had fostered. He said he wished that there was something that he and the nation could do to relieve the sense of loss for the families. The President went on to talk about the safety record of the American space program. He said that, "I am confident that there would be no flight till they," meaning the NASA folks, "are certain that it's safe." He remarked that this was indeed the first fatality in space that the American program has had. He said, too, that he's been so confident and now he feels so shocked. We asked the President how he felt about having the teacher, a citizen other than a regular astronaut, go up there. His remark on that was that this is what the space program is about. And to the children around the country who have watched so closely the development of Christa McAuliffe as an astronaut and the launch into space, he said that the children must learn, that must be made clear that life goes on. The President had, in fact, been anticipating a briefing, a background session on his State of the Union address tonight. He said, of course, that the State of the Union address will be given, that there will be mention made of the tragedy of the space shuttle. And he went on to say, but we can't stop the space program. We will continue. So indeed, Reed, the President very much shocked. The agony of this experience very visible on his face, his voice very soft and very disturbed by what has happened here. Reed?
Thank you, Charles Beerbauer, reporting live on the President's reaction to what has happened at the Kennedy Space Center scarcely a couple of hours ago. Mary Alice?
Thank you, Reed. With us here in New York is Dr. Robert Jastrow, who was founder and the first director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He was also first chairman of NASA's Lunar Exploration Committee. Dr. Well, you have not been directly involved in the shuttle program. You've watched it carefully for its scientific and commercial applications. It's been fraught with problems lately, mechanical and electronic, but never with tragedy before.
I think it's all so terrible. It's difficult to give a collected judgment, but I think the first thing one has to do is look back over the record of the program, which is now almost 25 years old in manned flight, and has had just two serious accidents. One was 19 years ago, almost to the date, and now there is this one.
A fire on the launch pad, that's right.
I think the record is as good as the human brain can make it, and you have to remember that these men and women have a risk which is about the same as that of a military test pilot. It's a dangerous job, and it should never be thought otherwise. I think the other point, please go ahead.
I was going to say, this is going to stop flights for a while, one presumes, until everyone finds out what on earth went wrong. Why do we need to continue a manned space program? Or do we?
That's the second and the larger point. If some of my scientist friends say we only need unmanned vehicles, then the shuttle is not needed. But I think they're quite wrong. You need manned flight because we are going to put up into space satellites that cost as much as $1 billion. We're putting one up next year, and later this year, to look into the beginning of the universe and out to the edge of space. And at $1 billion, they can't be thrown away. They've got to be maintained and fixed by man in orbit. And on the commercial side, where we get our dollar and cents return from these investments, You've got to have men up there, the brain behind the eyeball, to fix these automated factories that we hope to put into space and make sure the product keeps flowing. It just is necessary to carry through this pioneering effort until it becomes routine.
As a physicist and scientist who's watched this program very carefully, what is your view of the shuttle's ambitious schedule this year?
Well, I thought it was a reasonable schedule. It's a little more than one a month, and there's no indication that the schedule was responsible for this defect. I don't know what the cause was, but I think that we can look forward to monthly and then bi-weekly and then even more frequent launches. We just must push ahead if it is important to have man in space, and it seems to me and to most people that it is.
I'm going to ask you to speculate because it's something that none of us can tell right now, but you've been in mission control before. There are computers in there that give practically instantaneous readouts of what's happening inside that shuttle. How fast would those computers be able to generate information on what happened this morning?
You know,
in
Mary,
an uncontrolled, controlled
yeah.
explosion, which is what happened.
Yes, you have to be right on top of it to answer that question. Whether all the data came in or some vital piece of information was missing in the explosion itself is something I don't know. Only the people who are on top of it know, and only they can tell how long it will take to put the story together.
Talk to me a little bit about the training that these people go through. You heard Senator Jake Garn just moments ago talking about his training. It sounds like military test pilot training.
Well, it is, and as I mentioned, the fatalities, the risk is about the same as that of a military test pilot. They're important jobs, they're dangerous jobs, and the men and women who lay their lives on the line know that, and they do something that the nation is grateful to them for. It's terrible in an extra dimension that a school teacher, a wife, and a mother was also on board. But as the President said just recently, the purpose of the whole program is to make this flight routine. And
available to civilians.
Yes, because it will not be trained military test pilots and professional astronauts who will be fixing those factories and fixing those telescopes and those scientific platforms. We must overcome this pioneering difficulty and pass into a time when a shuttle flight doesn't even get on the pages of the newspaper.
You had not seen that the replay of what happened this morning before you were sitting with me, and you had a very tough time looking at it.
Indeed, well, it's just too terrible. And if you were closer to it, it would be worse yet. But I must repeat again that, you know, if there is a purpose to man in space, and there is, we need him for science and for the dollar and cents return on the program, then the shuttle is the way to go. And we must persist.
I want to go back to a very specific point. And again, I don't know if you can answer this because of your lack of direct involvement in the shuttle flight. This is the first shuttle in which, as far as we know, in which there were no ejection seats. Now, whether or not an ejection seat would have helped save the lives up there is obviously debatable.
I'm not informed well enough to say, but it looked to me as though the end was instantaneous in just viewing the tape of that explosion.
Okay, Dr. Robert Jastrow of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, thanks for being with us. We're going now to Dave Walker.
We will join Dave shortly, Mary Alice, with more information and background on what has happened today. First, Concord, New Hampshire, of course, the town from which the first school teacher in space, Christa McAuliffe, came, is stunned today. Reporter Howard Nielsen is at Concord, New Hampshire High School, where Christa McAuliffe taught and where they were watching this morning. Howard.
Yes, it's a state of shock here. The students at Concord High School were in a cafeteria watching the shoot live through a satellite arrangement with public broadcasting. There was a lot of joy, a lot of excitement, noisemakers cheering, yelling as the liftoff went. At first, it was not apparent what had happened. Nobody could quite understand it. And then, all of a sudden, one of the officials of the school realized that there had been this tragic event. He ordered the television monitor turned off, asked that everyone quiet down. Then it settled in. People realized what had happened. There was silence. And then students began crying. The news media, who had been in the cafeteria prepared to cover this event, were asked to leave the school. They did. The students then went to their individual classrooms. The administration officials went to the administrative offices to determine what to do. There was some brief counseling of students by teachers, and then the students were released to go home to their parents. We understand that there is a possibility of a news conference sometime around 3 o'clock this afternoon. Back to you.
Howard, I missed just a portion of what you said there, some activity here. Did you say the students are being sent home or that considerations being given to that?
The students have been sent home.
All right, thank you. Reporter Howard Nielsen at Concord, New Hampshire High School, a high school located in a city of about 30,000 people, the city that was home for crew member Christa McAuliffe. Joining us right now is Dave Walker with more information and some personal observations on space shuttle launches. Dave?
Thanks, Bob. And having observed numerous launches at the Kennedy Space Center over the years, the personal experience is awe-inspiring, as you might expect, and particularly when you view it for the very first time, you actually feel the impact of the combustion of the rockets. You see the fire developing underneath as you observe this from about 5 miles away. And then at the speed of sound, of course, you can begin to feel the impact. It's a popping noise, and there is a lot of palmetto around, or at least there used to be, the Kennedy Space Center. You can hear that begin to rattle. You can hear birds flying off, and there used to even be some rattlesnakes and alligators. They would become agitated themselves. But this is generally what it looks like. Not having observed a shuttle launch, I've observed several of the Apollo missions. But the force that is created here is enormous. And as I said, once again, when you're at the viewing center, the VIP stand or the press stand, you don't hear anything at first. You just see this huge fireball. And then a few moments later, you begin to hear a popping noise. And of course, everybody on the viewing stand, including the news media, as has become custom, begins cheering, applauding, saying, "Go, go." It is indeed one of the most startling experiences of my lifetime as a reporter. And, of course, today's developments draw attention as we try to possibly understand what happened. With us now is Professor Ben T. Zinn. He is Professor of Aerospace Engineering at Georgia Tech University. And, Professor, as you look at this, you can see a little bit of burning here on the propellant booster of the shuttle, and then you see the massive explosion. I know you have done some research into solid boosters. As you look at that, what would you speculate might have happened?
It looks like an explosion to me, and there's a phenomenon known as combustion instability, which often occurs in both solid and liquid propellant rocket motors. And if I had to make a guess at this time based on limited amount of information, I would guess that an instability occurred in the solid booster and caused the explosion.
So an instability in the solid booster in some form or fashion somehow ignited the enormous booster which is carried underneath the shuttle, causing the massive explosion. And you were telling me earlier that they have had some problems with those solid boosters. What sort of problems have they encountered?
Well, normally when we have a combustion instability, what happens is the pressure inside the solid propellant does not follow the pre-designed pressure time history. And
in other words, it has to burn at a certain rate.
It has to burn at a certain rate, and when an instability occurs, we obtain pressure oscillations. You can think of the booster as if it is an organ pipe in which a solid propellant is burning. And the instability is a disturbance, and it disturbs the...
Now, those are the solid boosters we want to point out to our viewers on either side of the liquid booster underneath the shuttle.
Well, if you see the end of on the two sides, you see the two ends of the solid boosters, and you can think of them as two organ pipes which are loaded with solid propellant. And when an instability occurs, you'll obtain longitudinal oscillations along the booster, pressure oscillations or pressure waves which are running back and forth, and they interfere with the burning process. They can cause acceleration of the burning process. They can result in extreme buildup of pressures, abnormal burning of the solid propellant, and eventually an explosion if the casing is not strong enough to withstand there's sufficiently large pressures which can build inside, the whole thing can explode. And maybe this would happen.
So these oscillations, as you described them, they run up and down the length of the solid booster itself, causing the booster itself to become destabilized in some form or fashion.
Well, basically, they destabilize the burning process of the solid propellant.
And once that happens, if a problem does develop, then this entire mass of solid fuel, which is not burned off, can explode? Like a firecracker?
It does not have to, but it can. Not every time you have an instability, it may lead to an explosion. And there are known solid boosters which have what we call slight instabilities in them, yet they are operational and there are no problems. But under some conditions, if there was some another defect, an instability can conceivably lead to such an explosion.
What had you learned? What sort of problems was NASA encountering? That oscillation problem you mentioned on the outside?
I'm not sure. I know that at least I've heard that at least in the development stages of those boosters, they have experienced some instabilities.
So there have been problems which we had not necessarily heard about, and you also meant, go ahead.
We have not heard about them, but NASA knows about them, and the other people know about them, and they've been working on them. It's not that we have had a problem and it was left unattended to. This problem has been worked on, and I'm sure that if they decided to attach this booster to the shuttle, then they felt that the problem has been taken care of.
One more question. Is solid fuel or the hypergolic fuels, is one more safe than the other?
You cannot say. It depends on the circumstances, depends on the design of the rocket motor. You really cannot make a general
One scenario
statement.
is possible. They could have encountered a problem aboard one of or both of the solid booster rockets, which could have ignited in some way the liquid booster container.
Only after the explosion. You know what? As long as the combustion is contained within the casing of the solid booster.
But we saw some tape right after the initial explosion there of at least one of the boosters still, or possibly two, still going on their course. What would that indicate to you?
I suspect that instability occurred in one of the boosters, not in both of them. And once it's exploded, then there was so much fuel on board in the liquid rocket and in the other solid booster that they just joined. Maybe the first explosion could have triggered the others to explode. But I suspect that one of them had some defect in it, something happened, it may have gone unstable, exploded, and then the rest of the Challenger, just exploded also.
Professor Zinn, thank you for joining us today from Georgia Tech University.
Thank you.
And we continue our live coverage. Marianne?
Thank you, Dave. As you know, at this point in time, the first participant in the Teacher in Space program, Christa McAuliffe, a 27-year-old social studies teacher from Concord High School in New Hampshire, was one of the crew members aboard this flight. And joining us now from Concord, New Hampshire, is one of her students, Mark Wittalian. Thank you for being with us this afternoon on what must be a very, very difficult day for you. Mark, can you explain to us exactly what it was like when you and the other students were watching what happened on television?
Well, we were just shocked that it had happened. Nobody even knew what was going on. I mean, we were just so surprised. I don't even think it's hit everybody yet.
What was the first reaction from you and your fellow students when you realized that indeed there was a disaster taking place and not an exciting, perfect mission and liftoff as we had first thought?
Well, we were really quiet. We didn't say anything, We sat around for a couple of minutes and they told us to go back to our classrooms. We were just stunned.
Are you at home now, Mark? We understand that the students were sent home from school. Can you tell us something about your teacher, Christa McAuliffe?
Well, she wasn't my teacher, but I knew her, and she seemed pretty nice, and I feel, bad about that happened.
I'm sorry, Mark, can you speak up?
Well, she wasn't I didn't have her in any class, but I knew she was. She was, a nice person. I think that it was good that she won the candidacy, but I can just say, now that I feel bad for her husband and her kid.
All right, thank you. Mark Wittalian of Concord High School, one of the students who knew one of the astronauts aboard the Challenger today, Christa McAuliffe of Concord High School in New Hampshire. Tom?
For those of you who may be just joining us, tragedy strikes NASA. 7 astronauts, including the first teacher in space, Christa McAuliffe, were apparently killed 1 minute after liftoff this morning from the Kennedy Space Center. Let's go back now to the shuttle Challenger on the launch pad. Launch Pad 39B. The first time this had been used for 10 years. It was last used in the Apollo program, but NASA redesigned and refitted this launch pad to allow the shuttle to launch from here, to give them 2 launch pads at the Kennedy Space Center.
9, 8.
Just a few seconds, you'll see the shuttle's 3 main engines fire up and start. Everything appeared to look normal.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range.
The shuttle has completed its roll procedure here.
Engines beginning throttling down now.
The brown
94%.
object you see in the center is the external tank that contains the highly volatile fuel, 2 solid rockets which propel the shuttle to its orbit on both sides of that tank.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
Because the shuttle goes through its most stress, they keep the engines down to 65%.
Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
The 2 solid rockets were not supposed to leave the side of the external tank and the external tank separation for another 7 minutes after the disaster occurred. This is where they throttle up, and the last words from the shuttle. It explodes in a huge fireball, one of the solid rockets veering to the right, another going to the left. Through the flame that's still burning there and the cloud, you could not see anything left of the shuttle. Let's go. We have a cutaway drawing here that I'd like to show you. There are contingencies just in case the shuttle careens out of control. NASA has 2 areas on the external tank that contain explosive charges. This is an option on every launch that they have. Not saying that it was used this time, but it exists, that if the shuttle would careen over a populated area, the range officer at Cape Canaveral Air Force Base, just down the coast, carefully monitors the shuttle's ascent, and should a point of impact where the spacecraft should suddenly fall, at the fingertips is a switch that would send an encrypted signal to start the detonation. We're not saying that this did occur, but it is one of the contingencies that will be investigated, I'm sure, as they look into this tragedy that struck the NASA shuttle program, and we've lost 7 of America's astronauts. Reed?
Tom, Senator John Glenn, the first American in orbit, now a senator from the state of Ohio, is about to tell us his feelings from the Senate gallery.
It finally has arrived. We hope we could push this day back forever. But the people that were on the flight today carried our hopes and dreams along with them, and they'll live forever in our memories. And I guess that's the best tribute we can give to them. Our prayers, our sympathy, our condolences go out to their families and friends, and I guess that's about all we can say about them right at this time. It's been an amazing success story up to this very tragic accident today. I think this was, what, the 56th or 57th manned mission, where we're dealing with new complexities and speeds and powers that man has never used before. And we had hoped to push this day back forever, but that was not to be, and we all, I guess, intuitively knew that. So today we don't want to repeat, that's for sure.
Senator, what effect does this have on a space program or any sort of flight test program when something like this happens?
Oh, it delays things, of course, because there will be a very complete investigation. Our view of what happened this morning would be only speculation at this point, although the very slow-motion pictures I saw on one of the channels a little while ago seemed to show the first light coming out of one of the solid rocket cases. Whether that'll turn out to be the cause of the difficulty or not, I don't know. But I wouldn't think that this was, you know, what it'll do to the program or how much it'll be set back will be dependent on the investigation.
Was NASA trying to push too hard on this, Senator?
No, I don't think so. If there's one thing NASA has not done all the way through, it is take a chance on cutting corners. And we've grown accustomed to success. And it's been an amazingly successful program so far. You know, I remember one of the TV commentators, I won't say which network, but one morning talking about when there was a delay, commenting, when are we going to get turn this turkey into an eagle? We'd become so accustomed to getting these things off on time that safety was obviously being, at least in that commentator's mind, was being given short shrift. Why aren't we running these things like a regular airline schedule? Well, the fact that NASA has not done that. They've run it with the idea of safety first and foremost, and that's been the way it's been operated ever since the days when I was in that program many years ago. It's a tribute to them that they have not been goaded under pressure to taking any chances. And we'll just have to wait the accident analysis to see what happened in this case.
Senator, were you watching the blast-off this morning?
I was not. I was in a classified briefing at the time, and one of my staff people brought a note in to me about this, and then I left immediately and went up to my office.
What was your reaction, particularly to the replays you've probably seen?
Oh, my reaction was a profound sense of loss, I guess, that this day had finally come that we'd hoped would never arrive. In some ways, I guess it's, you know, in our human existence, let me be philosophical for a moment. I guess in our human existence there is triumph and there is tragedy. And man tries many things. And we advance as a whole human race because we succeed most of the time. We make advances, whether it's in space or engineering or health or medical things. Sometimes, though, we aren't perfect. And then there's a tragedy that brings us back to our own human frailties and our lack of perfection. And so that's the kind of a day we're faced with now. It's been an amazingly successful series of triumphs through the years. But it also is fraught with the possibility of tragedy, and that's what we came up against today.
When you say that this was a day that was pushed back for a quarter of a century, was it inevitable that it would finally come?
Well, I think everyone that's ever had any connection with the program has felt that someday there would be a loss in flight. We're dealing with tremendous powers and speeds. You're traveling in orbit at 5 miles a second and trying to get back into the atmosphere from that kind of speed. And so, are we going to be perfect forever? I guess the answer was proven this morning, that the answer to that is no. But that doesn't mean that man doesn't keep trying in these areas and that we're not just as dedicated to seeing that this kind of research goes on.
Senator, you've been part of a small and very select community of people, the community of astronauts. What does this do to that community when something like this happens?
Well, we've never had something like this happen before, except for the pad fire, the fire on the pad that claimed 3 lives. Gus Grissom, Ned White, and Roger Chafee back in '67, I believe it was. So we went through that tragedy then, but that was not an in-flight accident. Obviously, there will be a shared sense of loss in the whole astronaut group and community, everybody associated with the whole program, whether astronauts or all those in the supporting functions. But I'm sure their dedication is going to be to find out what caused this and correct it and get on with the next flight.
Do astronauts just simply accept this as part of the job?
I think any time you go into flying or test flying, or which all of us were in prior to being in the astronaut program early on, you accept risks, but you feel that the risks are worth it for the country and the importance of what you're doing. And you're willing to take those risks. And that's the way we looked at it back then. That's the way I'm sure all of the current group of astronauts looks at it.
How much more of a tragedy is this since it was the first launch of a citizen in space?
A loss of human life doesn't have much to do with who's military and who's civilian. It's a tragedy for their friends and families, and I don't differentiate between the loss of life, whether it was the regular flight crew or whether it was a civilian on board with them.
How much does it set back the Citizen in Space program, do you think?
I don't know. I have no way of knowing at this point. They had lined up some other people to go, of course. Whether this will affect that or not, I don't know.
Do you think it should?
Does this raise questions for the SDI program?
No, I don't think so, because the technologies that were being used here as far as thrust and the engines and whatever happened here, I think probably are not likely to affect the research going on for lasers and laser projection and formable mirrors and particle beam projection and things like that. I would not think it likely that there was a connection there.
Senator, are you concerned now, or have you ever been concerned about the way NASA procures parts?
No, I never have. NASA has bent over backwards to be as safe as they possibly can be. And whether this will prove to be a one-time difficulty from whatever cause, or whether it will be a design defect that is uncovered now that we can correct, or whatever, we'll have to await analysis. But there's no way of knowing right now, just now, a couple of hours after the accident, to know what happened.
Senator, thank you very much.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
That is Senator John Glenn, the Democrat of Ohio, America's first man in orbit, expressing his sentiments on this morning's tragedy with the 7 aboard Challenger that exploded soon after takeoff. Bob?
Thank you, Reed. If, as is feared, none aboard the shuttle Challenger survived today's disaster, 7 American space pioneers lost their lives. The commander of this mission was Francis R. Scobee, known as Dick Scobee. He was 47 years old, born in Cle Elum, Washington. He became a NASA astronaut in 1978. Scobee was pilot of the Challenger mission in 1984, during which the crew retrieved, repaired aboard the Challenger, and returned to orbit the ailing Solar Maximum mission satellite. He was the commander of this mission.
36-year-old Judith Resnik was one of 3 mission specialists aboard this flight. From Akron, Ohio, a degree in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University and a PhD from the University of Maryland. During her mission on an earlier shuttle flight on her first trip, the crew successfully deployed 3 satellites. She had logged 144 hours, nearly 145 hours of space flight.
Christa McAuliffe was 37 years old. She was born in Boston, got her BA degree from Framingham State College in Massachusetts, later a master's degree in education. She had taught English and American history since 1970, selected as the first teacher in space in July of last year.
Ellison S. Onizuka was also aboard the Challenger today, an aerospace flight test engineer with the McClellan Air Force Base, a mission specialist with the, also participated in the first Department of Defense secret shuttle mission.
Gregory Jarvis was 42 years old. He was one of the other payload specialists aboard this Challenger mission. He had worked at Raytheon in Bedford, Massachusetts, and had been an integration manager for other spacecraft programs since 1983.
36-year-old Ronald E. McNair is a PhD. He was also a mission specialist. He was an astronaut since 1978 from Lake City, South Carolina, and graduated from North Carolina A&T State University and had a PhD in physics.
And finally, Michael Smith. He was 41. He was a very highly decorated U.S. Navy pilot, a veteran of Vietnam combat, had flown over 4,300 hours, including 4,000 of them in jet aircraft. He was pilot of this Challenger mission.
CNN has been informed that Donald Regan has asked the Speaker of the House to postpone tonight's scheduled State of the Union address. Let's go to Mr. Speaks in the briefing room.
Scheduled for this evening. He will address the Congress and the American people on next Tuesday. The President, in addition, has asked the Vice President to go immediately to Cape Canaveral's Kennedy Space Center, along with the acting NASA Director, Bill Graham. The Vice President will carry with him the President's personal concern for those courageous Americans who were aboard the space shuttle. In addition, the President will speak to the American people from the Oval Office later this evening regarding this tragedy. The President, since learning of the tragedy shortly before noon, has conferred with Don Regan, who in turn consulted with Speaker Tip O'Neill and Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. They concurred in the President's decision to delay his State of the Union. A few moments ago, the President met in the Oval Office with NASA Director Graham and instructed him to fly to the Cape with the Vice President to begin an effort to find out the cause of this tragedy. And then, the President said, to go forward with the nation's space program. The President said, and I quote, "These people were dedicated to the exploration of space. We could do no more to honor them, these courageous Americans, than to go forward with the program."
Can you tell us some of the reasoning in the decision to postpone, since, as you know, the President's first reaction was to go ahead with tonight's speech?
I think the President, like all Americans, has seen this tragedy unfold on television and has felt keenly what those family members must have felt watching that shuttle go into the air at the Cape, first pride and then second horror. The President feels that these same emotions are being experienced by people all over this nation at this moment. And with the consultation of Congress that's taken place in the last hour or so, the President thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred until, and let him address the American people on what's happening here tonight.
Administrator Graham tell him finally what happened? Does he have information, confirmation?
No, the NASA has issued a statement indicating simply that there was an explosion aboard the space shuttle shortly after it lifted off from the Cape this morning, and that a search and rescue mission is underway. That is continuing at this hour and will continue until all efforts to find out what the situation in there are exhausted.
Does the President believe...
Right. Great.
Larry, is the President also going to cancel his State of the Union activities for the balance of the weekend? What time is are the remarks tonight?
The President will, will for the balance of the week continue on his previously announced schedule, with the exception of those activities which were designed as a follow-up to the State of the Union. They will be rescheduled for next week. The time of the address to the nation has not been determined, pending definite word from NASA about the situation.
HHS, Treasury, and the high school he is not going to visit now.
That's right.
Larry,
Larry,
can you
let's
tell
go one
us,
at a time.
does the President have any plans to travel or attend any memorial service for the...
Well, at the moment, the NASA is still conducting its search mission there, and of course there's been no memorial service set. The Vice President does go with the personal expression of the part of the President of his concern to those families there, and no travel plans are set as yet.
Larry, two questions. First of all, I know you haven't had any official word, but is the White House operating on the basis that all of the people on the shuttle are dead?
Well, Chris, like every American, we hope, and until we find out otherwise, that hope will continue.
And secondly, to follow up on an earlier question, we were told by the President a few moments ago that he intended to go ahead with the State of the Union. In fact, said while it would cast a pall, the business of governing the nation must go on. What changed his mind in really a very short period of time?
Well, as I indicated to your colleague over here just a moment ago, is that the President, like all Americans, watched this on television, and he felt very keenly the emotion that must be felt by the families of those down there and that had to watch this event in person, and very keenly what the American people must be feeling. He consulted with the congressional leadership, and the consensus opinion of the executive and the legislative branch was that it was appropriate to postpone.
Larry,
So, Mike,
can you tell us what information the President is getting other than from television at this point?
Well, as I just said, the President has conferred with the director of NASA, and he brought him up to date, providing him with as much information as he can. There's not an extensive body of information at the moment that exists. NASA is looking into it as quickly as they can, and as I say, a search mission goes on.
Is there